Good evening. Welcome to Economics 330, Global Trade and Political Economy. As I hope we all know, this is the week 5, module 5. And this is, of course, also an abbreviated week, as, of course, I'm sure you're experiencing there is no class Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday. But of course, you still have assessment between Thursday, that is due 11:59 p.m. Friday. And that is why I will be recording this lecture. And of course, feel free to view it at any time that you want. But of course, especially between Thursday and Friday. In this module 5, we will begin today so this is the 5th week again, the week of September 22nd. And in module 5, we will begin a 3-part study of the 3 theoretical perspectives of global trade. And these perspectives include the liberal perspective, the realistic perspective, and historical materialism. This week, we will begin with the liberal perspective. And here is the definition. It is helpful to begin by noting that liberal perspective is not without distinctions. For instance, liberal economists emphasize the importance of the free market and private property and seek to limit government's role in economic affairs. Of note, liberalism is the most influential perspective in international political economy. However, some liberal economists favor as little government involvement as possible, while others believe that some government intervention is necessary for the effective functioning of markets. Simply put, liberal internationalism is a foreign policy doctrine that supports international institutions, open markets, cooperative security, and liberal democracy. Notably, the 3 types of liberal theory of international political economy includes 1. Orthodox liberals, who believe in negative freedom. That is, that markets should be given complete freedom to function. On the other hand, the interventionist and institutional liberals do not believe in negative freedom. Instead, they take the view that markets should not be given complete freedom. Note, this is one of those key phrases and words that I tell you that we're going to touch on every class that I think you should write down, make a notation of it, and to the extent appropriate, incorporate it into your daily engagement. And this phrase is laissez-faire. It's a doctrine opposing government interference in economic affairs beyond the minimum necessary for the maintenance of peace and property rights. The second are the interventionist liberals. They believe that strong international institutions, such as the IMF and the WTO and the World Bank, all of which we covered last week, of course, and I hope everyone remembers, should interfere in the functions of the market so that equality and justice can be ensured. Institutional liberalism, that's the third. They believe in government involvement in the market to ensure equality and justice. By understanding these 3 different perspectives, we are able to appreciate the sources of conflict within and among nations regarding trade policies. Furthermore, liberalism revolves around 3 interrelated principles. The first principle is the rejection of power politics as the only possible outcome of international relations. Furthermore, It questions the security warfare principles of realism. So if you ever wanted to see a real life example of power politics, witness the Russian-Ukraine war, where Russia essentially wants to wage war to achieve political ends or political ends. The second principle is an acknowledgement of mutual benefit in international cooperation. The third principle is an acknowledgement of the role of international organizations and non-governmental actors in shaping state preferences and policies. Liberal perspective emphasizes three factors, and there are lots of threes, I admit, that encourage more cooperation and less conflict among states. The first factor is international institutions such as the United Nations, which as we speak is hosting the General Assembly, which provides a forum to resolve disputes in nonviolent way. And we just saw an example of that attempt to resolve a dispute today in a nonviolent way when the French, I don't know how many of you are paying attention to the UN General Assembly, but I really recommend that you do. But you heard a speech by the French president, Emmanuel Macron, where he recognized the Palestinian state. And his argument is that it is a necessary precursor for the achievement of a two-state solution where Palestinians and Israelis get to live in peace side by side. Now, this would be a classic example of what the United Nations is envisioned to be, to provide a forum to resolve disputes in nonviolent ways. The second emphasis is international trade, because when countries, economies are interconnected through trade, they are less likely to go to war with each other. Think about it this way. If I need what you sell and you need what I sell, and your economy, your ability to finance trade requires the foreign exchange that you would earn from selling things to me, and vice versa. You could see how, especially for a democracy, it would be pretty difficult to go to war against each other. And simply because politicians are sensitive to economic shocks. And if you have close trading relationships, the chances are that if you have any kind of conflict with them, much less a military kinetic one, it would carry economic shocks. So the third is the spread of democracy, as well-established democracies hardly go to war with one another. As such, the logic is that if there are more democracies, interstate war will be less frequent. Again, for many of the same reasons that I mentioned, that in a democracy, the electorate, all things being equal, are sensitive to economic shocks, and they're sensitive to insecurity. And typically that does not, at least in the medium to long term, does not portend well for a government. Typically, when there's a violent conflict, there is a rally to the flag mentality that occurs in each country. But eventually people begin to question the wisdom of the conflict, almost always. So liberals believe that international institutions play a key role in cooperation among states via interdependence. So that means, again, you depend on each other for political support, for economic cooperation, and political alliance, and for geopolitical reasons. Of note, there are three main components of interdependence, and these include economic, financial, and cultural interdependence. So you could be economically interdependent, financially interdependent, and culturally interdependent. Economic simple answer, you buy and trade you sell and trade with each other. Financial means that there is a link to either borrowing, capital market engagements, and maybe loans. And the other is cultural means, which obviously sometimes is called soft power. Significantly, in the liberal perspective, security tends to not be the primary goal in state-to-state interactions, and military forces are not typically used. And another real-life example, again, I like to cite as much as possible real-life instances to make the class less theoretical and more practical. For a variety of reasons, the state of Israel struck a building in the Kingdom of Qatar. And the state of Israel took the position that it was struck the building because there were Hamas leaders having a meeting there. The political calculus is not the point of this conversation. The point of this conversation is that when the United States government wanted to mediate, it sent Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State. And that is a classic example of the liberal perspective that does not think that security tends to be the primary goal in state-to-state interactions. The President of the United States, Donald Trump, did not send the Secretary of the Defense. Instead, he sent the Secretary of State because there is a recognition in the liberal perspective that diplomacy is the best mechanism to resolve international disputes. So liberalism argues that international diplomacy can be a very effective way to get states to interact with each other honestly and support non-violent solutions to problems. With the proper institutions and diplomacy, liberalism takes the view that states can work together to maximize prosperity and minimize conflict. Lastly, let me quickly touch on a phrase you may have heard, I may have likely heard, or likely come across in your readings, perhaps some of your readings for this week. And that phrase is the Washington Consensus. This is a set of macroeconomic policies widely supported by leaders of intergovernmental organizations, multinational corporations, donor states, and economists. These policies include fiscal discipline, which is to maintain reasonable balanced budget. That is, you do not borrow for budget support. Rather, if you must borrow, it is best if it's for capital projects that have an economic value proposition. The second Washington the second of the Washington Consensus is public spending premised on economic return. Again, that's what I said. You don't borrow. Ideally, you don't want to borrow for budget support. And public spending must be premised on economic return, i.e., education, because an educated population is a more capable, productive population, healthcare, and infrastructure, rather than defense spending or subsidies. The third is low tax rates. The argument is that if you have low tax rates, you're likely to attract more foreign direct investment, and your economy is likely to be more competitive than others. The caveat to that is that this can, if not managed properly, setting up a low tax rate potentially lead to a race to the bottom, where neighboring countries are each trying to outgame each other by lowering their tax rate. Now, this is a win for private capital, but challenging for governments who obviously need tax revenues to fund public service. So there is a healthy balance. Again, as I say, with all things, you have to look at all sides of the argument and then say I'm balanced. The fourth of the Washington Consensus is money supply, controlled by professionals, not politicians. Again, we can see some of this argument playing out. which you can see within the tension between President Trump and the chair of the Federal Reserve Board. Obviously, President Trump, while he's the head of government and the head of state, he also holds a political position, and he is a politician. The chair of the Federal Reserve is a technocrat, and he holds a technocratic professional job. And you can see the tension between President Trump's desire as a politician for lower interest rates and the federal chair's imperatives to safeguard the economy by leaving some tools in the toolkit of the Federal Reserve for emergency purposes, and which is why I suspect there is that hesitancy there has been that hesitancy to lower interest rates. But again, this is a typical real life example of the tension in public spending premised on economic return and having the money supply controlled by professionals and not politicians. The fifth is to have exchange rates that are driven by markets. Again, on balance, this is the optimal policy, but sometimes you have to meet countries where they are. This is also part of the shortcoming with the Washington Consensus, because many would argue that emerging markets, developing countries cannot, may not have the luxury to fully float their currency, simply because floating that currency, the markets may lose confidence in that currency and it will tank. And then it makes debt repayment more challenging. So again, I don't want to get lost in the weeds, but again, optimally, you want to have an exchange rate that is driven by the market, but most developing countries do not have an optimal market situation. So the sixth is open markets to trade and investment. Again, this is where countries ideally should be headed towards. But as we now also see, there is protectionism, there are tariffs. And typically speaking, countries such as China have used closed markets to build their competencies and now have multinational juggernauts that are willing to dominate other markets. So, but these are the principles, some of the principles that the Washington Consensus advocates for. The seventh is deregulated economy and privatized national industries. Again, this is an ideal situation. Typical scenario for this is the United States, where the government doesn't really own much of an industry. It is in the hands of individuals and private capital. But even some of our allies in the European Union have a healthy mixture of both. But again, Washington Consensus would encourage countries to privatize national industries. And the last is protection of property rights. And this is one of those that is unequivocal. It is generally a very good idea to protect private property, and unequivocally, almost always a particularly bad idea not to protect private property. So this concludes the formal section of this week's lecture. Kindly note that next week, we will cover the realistic perspective in international political economy. And with that, I would end the recording.